So now we're going to talk about single subject design. Again, this is just a brief introduction. There are many other aspects to this, but this is just an overview for you to be able to understand the concept. So single subject experimental design is something you do with a single person or a single subject. Usually it's done when your sample size is pretty much one or a small group of individuals as your sample. And the idea again is for response to treatment. And in these scenarios, each individual serves as their own control. So, some of the things you have to make sure is baseline stability. So it's not sufficient just to have one baseline data point. You need to have at least three, but you can have more, and that would be fine. But it is very critical for you to have multiple data points because it may be that the reason the individual is not showing improvement is that just that one day that particular instrument did not work the way it was supposed to. So it is vital that you have, enough the three data points so you can get a median in there. And you really should only have one variable at a time. You should not be, for instance, changing multiple things across multiple children for multiple issues. So let's say that you want to do an intervention on reading, and you have this computer-based reading program, and that's what you want to study. And so you put that in place, you get 3 baseline points, and then you're gathering data on this individual, progress monitoring for 10 to 12 weeks. And then you say, oh, look, there's a huge improvement. And then you later find out that in addition, the parents were taking this opportunity to have the child do an hour a day of tutoring. Well, it's very difficult for you to determine which of the two interventions that was working. And it could have been a combination of both of them. But if the purpose is to determine the effectiveness of the intervention, you absolutely want a single variable at a time, a single intervention at a time. But when we're talking about that, that's for strict experimental designs. Now, when we're talking about what children, whether or not a child can respond to intervention, if the child's getting better and it's 2 or 3 interventions that's making that happen, it's not as important as, publishing a paper and saying this absolutely works because I have evidence that this treatment works. You're really much more, if 2 treatments working together is making this child get better, then just figure out what you want to do from there. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about. So the data analysis tends to be done through what's they're listed here as visual inspection, or what Randy Campbell's used to say, biocular examination, both of which are you look at it with your 2 eyes. And you determine based off of what you see if you think it got better, right? And so this idea a lot of times has to do with clinical effectiveness and not statistical effectiveness, which means that you're looking at the data and you're making the decision, do you think there's a big difference between what the baseline showed and what they were doing post-baseline? And there's not a particular numeric indicator of what a big difference would be. That's up to you, and that is one of the issues with this, actually, is that there's not a standard. So in addition, I've got a sample here for a single subject design. This is what's called an ABA design. So this is where you have a baseline, then you put the intervention in place, and then you do the baseline again. And you can see clearly here that when the individual had the intervention in place versus when the intervention was removed, you had a very clear increase of this. So I want to talk about a couple of things with this graph. One is that it says time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, whatever. That doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't say if there was 1 week difference between each of these times. It could have been a month difference. It could have been the same day, but morning, afternoon, evening. So that is one of the issues that you want to be careful of, is when you're evaluating it, you need to know exactly what they mean by these times. And oftentimes the baseline data may be collected 3 times, but I often would like to see more than 3 data points for the intervention phase. Um, yeah, so, this right here, this is the kind of thing that you might see in, say, an intervention that involves money. Let's say that I want my daughter to do the dishes, and she's not really doing them. Then I give her an allowance, and she gets money for doing them. And then I take the allowance away, and then she goes back to not doing them. That is what this kind of intervention would look like. Now, if we're talking about something like a reading intervention, it would be really unusual for you to teach a child how to read and they improve, and then you take the intervention away and then they completely forget how to read. So this ABA design may not be an effective method for something that once gotten or a skill that's gained that will not be lost from removing the intervention. Okay. So here is another way of seeing ABA designs. And again, we have sessions down here, and so we don't know how often these sessions happen or all those things. These are things that you would need to describe in a text. And then over here we have percentages, and you absolutely can use percentages. And you see the baseline is up, and then during the treatment they go down, and then you take the treatment away, and you go back up, and then the treatment comes back and you go down. So in this may be something like counseling as your treatment, and the baseline is your no counseling received, and the reversal is no counseling received. And the thing that you're looking at is how often do they feel depressed. So they're feeling depressed about 70% of the time during the baselines and the reversals, and much lower, and you can see dramatically that it's going down for both the treatment phases. And so this is one of those issues. So here's one of the questions though. How ethical is it for you to remove the treatment, right? So this reversal phase, there's really big problems. If we know that this individual who maybe again has depression, we remove the treatment and then in reversal they get so depressed they become suicidal. We've actually, for the sake of a research project, really caused potential harm to this individual by taking the treatment away. And so there are some issues with single subject design in terms of ethics and for studies in terms of the IRB approval. So you have to be cautious about this reversal phase. And so here is another option which has to do with multiple interventions. So wherein that you would collect the baseline data, you start the first intervention, and then you're seeing after a while it ain't working, and then you start a second intervention. You would want to make sure that you document exactly how it's working. So going back, with that previous example where I was talking about two confounding variables, if you were, say, to do this way, though, you have the baseline, and then you start the computer-based intervention, and you've done it for, whatever this is, 6 weeks or so. You're not seeing any improvement and at really of any point. And so then you change the intervention to this 1 hour a day tutoring that they're getting after school, and you see a dramatic intervention improvement. And so this way you can do two interventions and monitor both of them to see how the effectiveness works. The doing them both at the same, but in this, intervention 1 starts and ends before you start intervention 2. The problem becomes when you overlap those two, then you really do have a hard time of figuring out what happened. So, what I want for you to do on your own is just sort of sit and think about this. Bob has been having problems with reading. His words per minute rate was 24 on the first administration. And you can see that on the 10th of September, you see the first point is at 24. The other data from the baseline to intervention were graphed. And then, so we have baseline data, 10th of September through the 20th of September. Then you see the bright red line that tells you the difference between baseline and intervention. And I want for you to just pause for a moment to reflect the following questions. Were enough baseline points collected? Was the intervention done for long enough? Do you feel that the person had responded to the intervention? What reason might they have or have not responded to the intervention? Can you make a diagnosis of a learning disability and basic reading off of this? And what else would you need to do to make that diagnosis? All right, so if you pause, and welcome back. We're going to go through each of these answers. Were enough baseline data points generated prior to the intervention? Oh yeah, there's tons of data points, but they're all within 10 days of each other. And so that is something to consider is, you know, that nice, you don't want to have too long for your baseline because the child will just grow naturally through exposure. So I would say, there's way more than needed. They could have just done the first three and that would have been sufficient. Was the intervention in place long enough? The intervention was in place 5 days. I don't think a reading fluency done for 5 days is going to be considered long enough. Did the child respond to the intervention? Again, using this kind of analysis, all you're doing is looking at it. You're not making any kind of comparisons. There's no target. There's no goal. You just are looking at it. And with just looking at it, it really doesn't look like he's gotten any better. And why might this not have happened? Well, it only went on for 5 days. So it's really hard for us to know. Also, without knowing the intervention type, was it related back to reading fluency? Was it research-based? Those are other things we don't know. Can you diagnose him with a specific learning disability in basic reading? Absolutely not, because you didn't give us basic reading test, you gave a reading fluency test. Now, you may want to consider him for a diagnosis in reading fluency, but only with more intervention. Like you don't have enough data points and intervention time, and you've used the wrong assessment tool for basic reading. And then finally, what else would you need to do to make that diagnosis? Well, we just talked about that. You would need more intervention time, more sessions, and they would need to be the intervention and the assessments both need to have to do with basic reading and not reading fluency.